This is the Lebenthal Report with Michael Hartzman and Dominick Tavella. We'll break down the news, trends, and overall direction of the markets, telling you what may be coming next, investment opportunities, and what to avoid. Now, here are your hosts, Dominick Tavella and Michael Hartzman.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman. Today is Tuesday, December 13th, 2022, and I'm on, as always, with my partner, Dominick Tavella. Good evening, Dominick. How are you?
Doing well, Mike. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. Happy holidays.
You as well. And to our many listeners and viewers.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Happy holidays to everyone. Merry Christmas. Happy Hanukkah. Happy New Year. And we got to get that all in tonight because this will be our last show of the year. And we certainly have a lot to talk about, Dominick. But what's really interesting is the theme of 2022 seemed to be three things: interest rates, inflation risk, and a recession risk. And it seems over the last 6 or 7 weeks, definitely the last month or two, we've gotten some real focus on the first two. The inflation seems to be getting under control, which means the Fed now could give us hopefully a little bit more tea leaves on what they're going to do with interest rates. So as I said this morning on our call with our advisors, it seems to me, Dom, that we spent the first 10 months with the market looking for reasons to go down. And now it appears that the markets actually are looking for reasons to go up. What do you think about that analysis?
Well, the first comment is I think you're exactly right, Mike. I think if you go back to our first podcast for this year, it was all about interest rates and where are they going to go, inflation, how high, and eventually, hopefully, when will it roll over and start to come down? And what real risk were we looking at with regard to the possibility of a recession? So we do have clarity on those three issues, at least a little bit more than we did in January, right? We clearly the Fed's been on a pretty aggressive interest rate hiking policy, and we get another one tomorrow. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Recession, we said it from day one. We didn't think that was in the cards this year, this calendar year, but I think the possibility increases next year. And inflation, at least the numbers we got yesterday, show that it has crested and is starting to come down, but I think not quite as much as all of us would be happy if it came down a little faster, right? So even though we have some clarity in all those issues, Mike, there's still a lot of unknowns, and we're going to deal with all that going into next year.
Yeah, and just a quick recap of interest rates heading into the year. If you remember correctly, in the beginning of 2022, the Federal Reserve was talking about maybe raising interest rates 2 or 3 times, 25 basis points a time. At a time, right?
Yeah.
It sounds adorable in hindsight.
Yeah.
Right? And all of a sudden, by March, there was a sea change. There were screaming headlines about $5 a gallon of gas. You know, inflation was hovering around 8 or 9% on an annualized basis. And the Fed realized pretty quickly, well, maybe not quick enough, because that's why the market sold off, that they were behind the 8 ball and really had to do a lot of catch up. And boy, did they do a lot of catch up, I would say, between May and October.
Yeah, I think combined, the first 2 increases were 75 basis points, about 0.75%. The next 4 were 0.75% each. So I think, again, Mike, spot on. I think you said it correctly. You know, they gave us a line about how aggressive they were going to be in raising interest rates, and they quickly came off of that and now have been pretty aggressive in their interest rate hiking policy. Hopefully that changes tomorrow and they slow things down a little bit. But yeah, they just decided very quickly. I won't go as far as saying that they were wrong, but that they needed to change their thinking and really, really come down hard on this inflation number.
You know, I think some Fed governors admitted they were wrong, right? I mean, you know, they don't have one brain in there. Some of them are more hawkish and some are more dovish. But I think, and I don't think anything is done by accident or off the cuff. And I think that purposely, at some point during the year, there was some messaging indicating that they need to play catch up. I think preparing the market and the investment community that interest rates were going to go up quicker than anticipated.
And all with the stated goal of slowing down the economy, because ultimately higher interest rates means that whether it's individuals or businesses, since they have higher borrowing costs, are likely to borrow less, spend less, and put less pressure on the economy at a time when things were, especially early on in the year, Mike, things were constrained, right? We still had a lot of supply chain issues, and those have cleared up a little bit, maybe more than a little bit, but overall things are getting better. And as we've said, the inflation number has started to come down pretty decently, but a long way to go, a long way to go.
And just to put those interest rates in context, using my cheat sheet that I use every week from JP Morgan, last year at this time, the 2-year Treasury, Dominic, was paying 0.73, 0.73, 3/4 of a point, a little less. Right now, it's paying 4.33, which is basically, what is that, 5 times more
Yeah,
in a year?
even more, right?
So that's a remarkable jump in a very short period of time.
And look, some people describe this as the crack in the armor, but we've seen, since mortgage rates have gone higher, we've started to see real estate prices roll over. We've seen the unemployment numbers. I mean, overall, there's still a lot of jobs, and we're seeing wages go up, but all of a sudden companies are laying people off. So we started to see the unemployment numbers go a little bit higher. And overall, the economy seems to be slowing down. And I think this is the great fear, that will they get this right and the economy will slow down, but not go over the cliff? Or will they push it too hard and then we're dealing with a recession and way worse numbers, economic numbers?
Yeah, and as we know, a recession is based on something we've already lived through. And economic data is the past, right? And markets like to look forward, but there's no doubt, Dominic, that if we're in a recession, it's going to be a heck of a headline. And if it's a short-term recession or a shallow recession, as they say, then it's headline risk. If it's a long-term, deep recession, people start losing their jobs, then whatever we might think might happen in 2023, all bets might be off. But I think if we look at the price of energy, that's a good way to put all this in context, because in the beginning of the spring of this year, I think energy, gasoline was about $5-6 a gallon, right? That was the headline. They were interviewing people at the gas pump. How much is it going to cost you to fill up your Yukon? The typical stories that we see. Oil was $100 a barrel. But here's what's interesting, Dominic. On December 31st of last year, 12/31/21, gasoline was $3.28 a gallon on average in America. It closed last week at $3.39, 11-cent difference. Oil was $75.33 on December 31st, closed last week lower, $71.02. So if you took a vacation from the news and from last New Year's Eve to right now, you would have thought nothing happened.
But a lot's happened.
But a lot has happened.
An awful lot has happened.
Exclamation point.
As my graying hair will attest. Correct on all those numbers, Mike. But 2 quick points. The first is that energy prices were a lot higher in between.
Yeah, a lot higher.
A lot higher. I think oil hit over $120 a barrel at one point. And then you have to ask yourself, and maybe I'm going to ask you, well, if the economy is humming along really well and the risk of a recession is pretty low and the employment numbers are so good, why would energy prices be going down?
Well, I think it's for a couple of reasons. One, one, and I use Exxon as that proxy, right? So Exxon hit its all-time high about a month ago, all time. How long has Exxon been trading? 80 years? I mean, I don't know how long it's been on the exchange. So number one, there's profit taking is my belief. And number two, Dominic, the stock market's also had a pretty decent quarter, has a nice rebound. We're going to get into that a little later. So if people are going to start reinvesting in technology or healthcare or financial services, sectors that have been beaten down, the money's got to come from someplace. So if they're reallocating, that money may be coming from energy, but I think it's some smart people profit taking, among other things.
I would think that's a pretty good answer, Mike, right there. It's by far been the best performing sector all year, with just really, really incredibly good numbers. And maybe you want to take some profit off the table and maybe use it to buy things that have gotten beat up, as technology has been one of the worst performing sectors this year. So maybe you take some of your profits and you buy things that have gotten beat up. But you also have to look at the possibility that if we were to go into a recession, then the economy and the global economy would be using a lot less energy, right? There'd be a lot less demand. So maybe it's being prudent, careful. Hey, you know what? We've done really well. Let's take some of the money and roll it over. Maybe it's like not be greedy and just lock in some profits. And maybe it's some of, hey, this economy is probably going to go into a recession, mild or could be deep, as you alluded to. Either way, why would you want to hold an asset that would get beat up if the economy, the global economy, were to go into recession? So for a multitude of reasons, energy the last month has actually been the worst performing category.
Correct. I remember at some point looking at one of these charts, the energy sector was up like 80 or 85% at some point year to date.
Oh, yeah. I mean, again, we're going to go back to midsummer, and the price of oil in general was well over $100 a barrel. And the price of energy ETFs and these stocks had hit all-time highs. So again, I think you gave a bunch of really good reasons why, maybe it would, at the very least, it's time to take some profits and position yourself for the next round. But I'm still going to focus on that there's at least a possibility of a mild recession, maybe the first half of next year. And it's prudent to get ready for it before it happens, not after it happens.
I think as the saying goes, that a mild recession is probably already baking the cake. But here's what's really interesting. We talked briefly about the job market. We both talked to probably between 50 and 70 clients a week on average. I have not had one client say to me that they fear for their job, say to me they need to slow down their spending, or say to me they've actually lost their job and we have to roll over their 401k. Every 401k rollover I've done this year is either because someone retired or someone changed their job. But Dominic, I haven't had a single client, thank God, knock on wood, who's actually lost their job because of weakness in their sector or their company.
We're starting to see the headlines, Mike, and particularly in the technology sector.
Right.
And that's because they overhired, right? That's sheer function of, when the economic market for them, 2020, even part of 2021, was really going well. They just hired like madmen. So now they're in a position where they have to let some of those people off. And I personally have gotten some notices that clients are being laid off. And in one particular case, an entire division was being closed down. But I agree with you. It's the exception.
Mm-hmm.
We think that employment stays relatively healthy through next year, but could it be a little bit higher than it is today? Yeah, I think you can count on that one, Mike. I think it's reasonable to assume that. But the biggest issue for me, and I think for a lot of people like you and me, Mike, is that, the Fed, as you brought up, had to do a pretty aggressive course correction early part of this year, as they did a year ago, again. And you're going, well, I haven't gotten this one all that right so far. What makes you think they're going to get it right going forward? And I'd love to kind of pose that question to you, Mike. Are they going to get it right over the next 6 to 12 months?
I think a little bit of it depends on the comments that Jerome Powell, Chairman Powell, gives us tomorrow. They'll announce at 2 p.m. more than likely a 50 basis point rate hike. I think that's the expectation. And I think people will be hanging on his every word in his press conference. So Jerome Powell, I think, is in a very tight spot because he's worried about overcorrecting, as you said, but he's also, I think, concerned about making the economy, or making the market, I should say, too giddy, right? And I think he wants to keep us vigilant and on our toes. And I think that's the dance that he has to do. I do believe that he will get it right from the point of view of not putting us crashing into a full-blown, holy cow, 2008 type of recession. But what makes me a little nervous, Dominic, is we're already hearing that by the midpoint of 2023, or a year from now, that the Fed is going to start lowering interest rates.
Well,
So,
let me stress one point on that comment, Mike. The only way the Fed is lowering interest rates is if we are in the middle of a recession.
I agree with you.
So, this idea that the Fed is going to be lowering interest rates any point next year, be careful what you wish for. And I'm not saying it's you wishing for it, but clearly some of, I love to call them bobbleheads in a box. These people on TV are talking about lower interest rates a year from now and the Fed being forced to lower interest rate. I want to emphasize that is only if we are in a recession, and maybe even a deep recession. So
Right.
I don't know that we want to be in that environment a year from now.
Right. And if you look at the history of interest rate cycles, Dominic, it's a stair step going up. It's a flat line for a period of time, and it's a stair step going down, right? It's methodical. So the idea that we would raise interest rates at this record pace and then suddenly 6 months later pivot is almost ridiculous to even hope for.
Certainly not hope for, right? You would hope that if we were in some kind of economic crisis, as we were in 2020 with COVID, that the Fed would step in and provide support to the economy. Having said that, we don't hope for that. We don't want an economic crisis. And if we get to a point, and hopefully this is what happens, where January, February, the Fed says, okay, I think we've raised enough, and we're going to sit here for a little while and see what the economic impact is. Because remember, higher interest rates take time to funnel through the economy. It takes time for those higher interest rates to take effect. So, it's a lagging indicator, as many of our economic things that we look at are. It's an indicator. So hopefully the Fed lets these things settle in, lets them filter through the economy and see what the economic impact is, and then makes a decision accordingly.
And you know what? One part of the economic impact that is not even talked about, Dominic, is a lot of middle-class Americans, hardworking Americans, have home equity line of credits, HELOCs, and they use them pretty frequently. And they've been budgeted in at a notoriously low interest rate for several years now.
And never went up. Do you remember that, Mike? We in our reviews with our clients, those HELOCs were locked in, and you're like, do you think I'll ever see higher interest rates? And we kind of normally go, well, not in the foreseeable future. But guess what? Now the phone calls are, oh my God, this thing actually went higher, right? The interest rate went higher.
Right. So those folks are in for a sticker shock. And that is where, Dominic, it's the little things that start to fall off, right? It's we're not going for the $200 meal. We're going for the $75 meal. We're not rushing out to buy new clothes. We're just going to wash these another 6 more months because they look fine. It's those little purchases that go by the wayside as people's budgets get chipped at. So yeah, the high price of gas did that immediately, but people's rare variable rate mortgages and people's home equity line of credits, Dom, they're in for sticker shock if they haven't already experienced it.
Yeah, and we could throw in the interest rate that they're paying on their credit cards. We can talk about the car loan for the new car they're going to go buy. Everything becomes more expensive. And I've brought this point up many times before in our past, Mike. Even if you can afford it, even if you think about on a monthly basis, it doesn't really, the extra amount that you're paying doesn't really affect your lifestyle. Psychologically, like the price of gas, psychologically, it makes a difference, and people do start to change their spending habits. So I think you are spot on that one, Mike. Whether it's going out to dinner, how often they go out to dinner, or where they go on vacation, even if they can afford it, psychologically, it changes their spending habits. I remember
you and I had a conversation in May because you got a client who was planning a Memorial Day road trip, like to upstate New York. He wasn't driving to LA. And he said to you, I'm not going. And you said, but it's going to cost like another $60. You cancel your trip for $60. It's like, I'm not going. And you could not convince him not to cancel his Memorial Day family vacation because the thought of paying an extra $60 for gas was horrifying.
Yeah. And again, whether this individual could afford it, and he could, right? And many of our clients can afford the extra expense. There's quite a few Americans out there, and I would argue maybe as much as half the population that can't afford it, Mike. And that's a whole nother discussion, right? Where that extra cost of fueling their house this winter, that extra cost of putting gas in the car, or going to the supermarket and buying food, or prescription drugs, you know what? That does affect their lifestyle. That does affect their ability to pay their bills on time. And so when we talk about the risk of a recession, I think what we're really talking about, Mike, is the ability for people to spend money the way they were, and whether it's real because they don't have the extra dollars, or psychological because they don't want to spend those extra dollars, they're not going to spend them, Mike. And when they don't, the economy continues to slow down.
I heard a statistic, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, it's a whole other show, but I heard a statistic that 50% of American workers have savings of $400 or less. So could you imagine what the effects of inflation is on someone who has an extra $400, how quickly that gets chewed up just in your food bill?
Yeah. And, we've spent a lot of time talking about energy, and you brought up some really good points, Mike, on the price of gasoline and the price of oil. And for this discussion right now, let's just call oil roughly about the same kind of price as it was a year ago. But, what's the price of food, right? What's the price of other items that you need daily to live? And inflation has started to roll over. You can argue that inflation today is less than it was 2, 3, 4 months ago, but it's still way higher than it was, way higher than it was 2 years ago. And I think I agree with some of the experts that it will be much lower a year from now. But in the meantime, you can't ask the average American, is your cost of living lower today than it was a year ago? No, it's not. It's simply not.
No, it's definitely not. Look, I don't have any more people living with me in my house than I did a year ago. And every week consistently, my food bill at the supermarket is $100 more a week easily, right? And the other part of it is the packaging is smaller, right? It's very insidious the way companies deal with this. Even if they don't raise the price, if your units is smaller, it's still this. You're gonna have the same effect on you if you need to buy it. So, I hope for the average consumer that we do not have a severe recession, because forget the stock market, the ripple effects of that literally affects every sector.
Look, at the end of the day, we always crunching numbers and we're looking at stock prices, we're looking at indexes, but this is people and their real lives and their ability to put food on the table. So, the most simple way I can put it, it's people's ability to live, and it's serious. And we focus on the stock market being higher and lower, but it really is an indicator of people's ability to live, right? Live the quality of life that they want. So I do think that the Fed is going to try to be careful about what they do going forward. I think they're very much aware, and I think Chairman Powell has talked specifically about it, that it doesn't do their very much good to just put the economy in a complete recession and get unemployment through the roof. So I think they're going to try to be careful, but we also have to be very aware that what they're trying to do is really not easy, Mike, and not something that you just dial it in and hit the button, enter, and it happens.
Very proud of you. We've been talking for 28 minutes and you haven't used the expression soft landing once.
Oh, well, let me say this, Mike, and maybe we could pick it up on the next segment. But I kind of promised myself I wouldn't, because it just makes my head explode. Right? This will not, underline, not be a soft landing. This will be a fighter pilot landing on an aircraft carrier in the middle of a storm. He will bounce the plane 3 times, but ultimately he'll get out of the cockpit and he'll walk in and sit down and have a nice meal. But it will not be a soft landing. He's going to bounce that plane 3 times, but he will get out safely and see his family down the road. So to that point, Mike, it's going to be bouncy. It is nothing about this, I believe, will be smooth and easy, but we will get through it and we will be able to walk away.
So let's do this. Let's take a quick break and on the other side, we'll talk about what we do see happening in 2023 in addition to a recession. There are some sectors we could talk about. Some parts of the market have been completely ignored for 2022. So we'll pick this conversation up on the other side after a quick break.
Now,
Great.
back to the Leventhal Report.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman, back with Dominick Tavella. So Dom, recessions are backward looking, as we said earlier, right? The economic data we get, it's already happened. We've already lived through it. Markets are forward looking. Markets like to look ahead. Markets are opportunists, and markets are optimistic, right? They want to know, where's Netflix's next big hit? Where's Pfizer's next drug? Where's Ford's next exciting car or truck, right? So with that in mind, what are you hearing from the experts in terms of earnings? What are you hearing in terms of, what the experts expect for the market in terms of not the economy, but, earnings and companies' prospects to continue to grow in 2023?
So I think there's 2 camps out there, and it's a pretty dramatic difference between the 2 camps, Mike. The first camp is looking at the beginning of next year and saying that we probably are going to go through an earnings recession. And this is where companies are just not going to make as much money, right? Whether it's people spending, whether the cost of goods to manufacture are high and their profits get squeezed, but earnings are just not going to be that great. And then the second camp is talking about, the consumer is pretty resilient and the spending is going to be pretty consistent. And not only will we have the expected earnings, but we might even have an earnings increase, which, by the way, is kind of what happened this year, right, Mike? It was pretty doom and gloom on what company earnings were going to be this year, and they've held up pretty good overall. So you have 2 distinct camps, one that thinks it might get pretty ugly, and one that says, no, I think we'll muddle through, especially with the second half of next year being strong and a pretty decent recovery in the market through the second half of next year. So we have 2 very distinct camps, both with pretty sophisticated, knowledgeable people who, we've talked to personally and rely on their opinions, but two distinct camps, the doom and gloomers and the ones that, yeah, it may not be as bad as some people think.
What do you think?
I've always, and I know you've heard this about 100 times, Mike, so I apologize for boring you, but I always kind of abide by the philosophy when the experts think that things are great, they may not be quite as great as they think. And when experts think, oh, it's doom and gloom and the world's coming to an end, it may not be quite as bad. And that's my airplane pilot landing on an aircraft carrier analogy. I do think we might see the first half of next year where things are a little bit bumpy, maybe a little bit scary at times. But I do think we have a very resilient economy. We do have historically a very resilient consumer. And in the end, and I'm meaning that would be the end of next year, if we can get through the bumps and maybe bruises the early part of next year, we could be in a position where the market does quite well by December 31st of next year.
I agree with you. And you use the same word twice in your description and analysis, and that's the consumer. And the consumer has dragged this economy for years, dragged it along on its back. The consumer is so resilient, right? Whether it's travel or spending money on home improvement or just, in retail stores or buying online. The consumer has been remarkable, their appetite to continue to spend money. So then, Dominic, we come full circle, and it's about jobs still. Because I think the only thing that could slow the consumer down is obviously, God forbid, if more than we expect start to lose their jobs.
And Mike, you're a small business owner. I'm a small business owner. Most of the headlines that we're seeing are these large Fortune 500 companies, right? And I know laying off 1,000 people, that's, I feel horrible for those people that have to go home and not have a job. No one wants to see that. But they also employ tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. So in the big scheme of things, they're definitely adjusting the total number of people that are employed, but it's not making a dramatic difference overall in the number of people that they have on the books. And here's a shocker: small business owners are actually responsible for the majority of hiring in this country. Mike, when was the last time you laid somebody off? When was the last time you said business is slow and I'm sorry, but you have to go home, I'm going to fire you? When was the last time that ever happened?
Never.
And
I've never laid anyone off.
And I honestly, I don't think I'm wrong on this one, but I don't think I ever have in my entire life. And look, if business got so bad, I guess we'd be forced to do that. But the reality is, a small business owner is very careful about hiring somebody and then excruciatingly careful about laying that person off. Because, and I'm stating everything Mike, and everything you believe as well, but these people become part of our family and part of our inner group, and to send somebody home and not give them a job is horrific, right? So we're very, very careful to hire, and very, very careful before we decide that person no longer has a job. And most of America functions that way. Most small business owners function that way. So I don't expect any mass layoffs especially by the small business community.
Again, I do agree with you. And let's not forget, the PPP program from COVID from 2 years ago was controversial, but it also gave a lot of small businesses, Dom, that shot in the arm, that cash infusion that I still hear today. Thank God for that, because it's given me the confidence now so that we'll ride through this wave as well. So, for whatever the PPP, whatever controversy was around that at the time, it did serve a very valuable purpose. Of all the government programs that you and I have lived through and giveaways that we've lived through, I do believe that one was meaningful.
Psychologically, it allowed business owners in general to go, let's just hit the pause button, because let's be honest, we didn't know, Mike. We didn't know how long. We'd never lived through anything like that, and we didn't know how long it was going to last, and we didn't know whether this is an event that was going to be 3 months or 3 years. And so at the very least, it gave everybody a moment to go, let's just see what happens, and then we can talk about whether businesses could open the doors again and function. But part of that program, Mike, was putting an awful lot of money into not only the businesses' hands, but individuals, right? Mm-hmm. And one stat I heard this week was there's still over $1 billion of sitting in individuals' bank accounts from government programs. Mm-hmm. And they are spending it, right? They're spending about $100 million a month of that money. But we're looking at 6 to 12 months down the road before they run out of that excess government deposits that were made into people's bank accounts. So that's another reason why I'm kind of confident that if we saw a recession, it would be kind of mild, and the consumer's not likely to come off of their spending, at least not in a reasonably short period of time.
I agree with you. Let's pivot for a minute. We haven't really talked about the fixed income market all night. The fixed income market has also had a horrible year for the same reason. It just disconnected from reality when it lost faith in the Federal Reserve's ability to fight inflation. Literally was the worst bond market in 40 years. You know, you and I talk a lot about the muni market, typically a safe haven, great way for seniors to get dividends. And finally, again, there's a little bit of a glimmer of hope. The muni market rallied we're in December now, rallied in November over 4%, which, you know, sometimes the muni market doesn't move 4% in the entire
in a year,
right? It's still down over 8% for the year, Dom. So it's still pretty ugly, but I still think if we get some focus and clarity on when the Fed will stop raising interest rates, I think the muni market could have a decent recovery in 2023 as well.
Along with corporates and even high yield if the economy stays relatively stable. So I couldn't agree with you more, Mike. And I'll add that for the first time, a client, whether it's a bank account savings, a money market, buying an individual bond, for the first time in a very, very long time, they're going to get paid. One of the dirty secrets of the economy over the last couple of years is that you couldn't get a CD that paid you virtually anything significant. You couldn't buy a treasury, a government bond that paid you anything significant. And even a corporate bond, you just were not getting paid. And so it was really people who were fiscally responsible, who had savings that were funding the economic growth by getting 0% return on their investments. Today, you will get paid a reasonable rate to hold those bonds. And I don't think that's a terrible thing, Mike. I think these people deserve finally to make a reasonable amount of return on their investments.
Absolutely. And what it also does, Dominic, it does put a little pressure on the stock market, because let's not forget, stock market was the only game in town for years.
And we talked about that, right, Mike? Where we would get calls and like, well, if you really want to try to make any reasonable rate of return, you had to go to the equity markets. Today, that's not true. That's not true. And that's not a bad thing.
No, it's not a bad thing at all. So let's talk about another sector. Believe it or not, there's a whole other world. I don't know if you know this or not. A whole other world outside of the USA, whole other markets, whole other stock exchanges. You know, the international sector has literally been ignored for years. In this country. So I guess the dumb question, with 2 weeks to go to the new year, what do you think of international investing? What do you think of Europe and Asia? And, you know, in China in particular, and Japan in particular?
Well, let me start, maybe just poking fun a little bit. For years, you and me have sat in many a conference or in front of a portfolio manager, and all they could talk about was, oh my God, how undervalued international stocks were, how undervalued emerging markets were. And look, it's hard for me to, I'm trying to do this with a straight face because they were right, but they got worse. They got even more undervalued.
Right.
They got even more discounted, right? And you look at what's going on in Europe, certainly with the Russia-Ukraine event. Look at what's going on in China and their own COVID problems there. And then you look at international crises, whether they be in certainly Europe or the Far East or South America. And you understand that, yeah, these stocks are cheap, but they may be cheap for a reason, and they certainly can get cheaper. We might be getting to a point where, and by the way, one of the major reasons I think we've overperformed this year relative to our peer group is because we've completely, I don't want to use the word eliminated, but let's politely say underweighted our exposure to international, where a lot of the competitors have not. They still have 20, 30% of their portfolios in international, and they've paid dearly for that. Right. But I think we're starting to get to a point where we can look at some of these sectors and go, hey, is it time to introduce some of these back into our client portfolios? I don't think it's something we would do in the short run, but I certainly looking at some of these sectors and going, they at least should be considered, and maybe at some point maybe reintroduced into our client portfolios.
So Dom, I think what the nuance there is it sectors or is it countries?
Both, Mike. Right. Both. There are countries that they might have certain sectors that are appealing, but we wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. And again, we don't need to rattle off countries at this point in the game, but I think they're pretty obvious that you might like the Russian energy sector. Oops, I said it out loud, but we're not going to go anywhere near stuff like that. But you have to look at first, I think, the sectors that you like in general. And then if you want to look at the international arena, where are there countries that you feel relatively comfortable about the currency, you feel relatively comfortable about the political scenario there, the financial markets in those countries. So it's not quite as easy as, okay, let's just throw a dart. It's scary stuff.
I think it's really interesting. And I'm not a political expert by any stretch of the imagination, but just looking out at the news out of China the last 10 days, you get the feeling that the Chinese government blinked a little bit, as it related to COVID restrictions, which were super tight, super restrictive. And the Chinese citizens basically said, we've had enough. 3 years.
Yeah. And I, they would probably argue they didn't blink, but it's hard to say they haven't, Mike. They've done a pretty dramatic turnaround in their COVID policy, which was very restrictive. They wouldn't shut down just individuals. They would shut down entire cities that were larger than New York. They would just shut them down. You can't leave your house kind of deal.
They were bringing food to these people.
Yeah.
I know.
So the population there clearly said we've had enough. There were protests in the street. There was some violence. And I think, the Chinese government, and it's just my opinion, it's not worth anything other than saying it out loud, that the Chinese government says, yeah, maybe we were being a little bit too restrictive. And we've seen some of that and other issues around the world where governments are starting to wake up a little bit and understand that you can't just keep a population down forever. There's a price to be paid, and maybe they need to compromise a little bit. So hopefully that's for the better, right? But and maybe somebody might look at Chinese stocks and go, well, they've been so depressed. That's where the opportunity is. But I don't think that's an area where we, at least in the short run, would consider, even if the opportunity was there, Mike. That's, again, not just looking at opportunity, but looking at the political scenario, look at things like currency. Sometimes the risks just outweigh the potential reward.
I don't think we would be throwing money at China right now, but I do think that will ease up the supply chain problem once and for all, because a lot of the supply chain issues kind of, emanate from China
Yeah.
because of all the parts and components that we need to complete our products are made there. So to me, I agree with you. I don't know if we're throwing money at the Chinese, as a country, as an investment opportunity, but I do think they're loosening up a little bit will help overall all of the markets, because it'll take a little pressure off of supply chain issues, which also will take off a little pricing pressure on autos and computers and so forth.
And that ties into the inflation argument, Mike.
Right.
So look, companies are not stupid, and it does take sometimes decades for companies to plan these things out. But it's clear that a lot of U.S. companies learned their lesson that, having so much of their manufacturing tied into one country could be catastrophic, right? So they're moving manufacturing out of China, a lot of it in the Far East and India, but they're moving it out. They're also bringing manufacturing back into the United States, going, it might be a little bit more costly, but we could do it in an efficient manner and save on shipping costs. And speaking of shipping costs, where that was a real big indicator of just how tight the product moving from one part of the world to the other was, shipping costs have dropped through the floor, and you have a lot of empty containers now. Again, another indicator that maybe inflation has peaked and down significantly going forward.
So just put a bow on the international sector, Dominic. I know you spent a lot of time in Europe, Lord knows. What's the economic environment there like?
It's a good news, bad news story, Mike. There is a lot of economic activity. So day to day, in fact, it's for somebody like myself who goes there regularly, it's kind of a stark contrast to see how busy people are and how committed to their workday they are. It's a little unusual for me to witness something like this. On the other hand, inflation is really taking a bite. They feel it way more. They have more of it than we do. Let's start with that. And because of their wages tend to not be quite as high as ours overall, they're feeling it a lot more. So I think Europe's path to recovery is going to be longer than ours, and they're more likely in a recession, and maybe a deeper recession than we are. Back to your international question, Mike. Even though we like European stocks in general because they're at a discount to U.S. stocks, I think the prospects for economic growth are worse there. And so we would be very cautious in Europe.
And don't forget, Dom, heading into the winter and the war in Ukraine is still going, they're way more susceptible to the price fluctuations, and having to heat their homes this winter could really put a damper on their budget as well.
You're exactly right, Mike. The good news there is that they've been very aggressive in building up their reserves and preparing for winter. They were very much at Russia's mercy, and so they have worked very diligently to build up their reserves, energy reserves, and things like natural gas, and LNG, liquefied natural gas coming in. They've built ports in months where it used to take years to do it. So they've been very diligent. On the other hand, it's going to be a tough winter. It's going to be a tough winter for most of Europe.
I believe you, Dominic, and everything you said, but like millions of other Americans, I just finished watching The White Lotus, and the Sicily's economy seems to be fine to me.
So, all right, you got me on that one, Mike. Again, I'm going to emphasize that seeing the amount of economic activity has been surprisingly a little bit better than I had suspected it would be. And part of that is the euro has been really beaten up. I don't want to get too wonky, but we had the euro on par with the dollar, which we haven't seen in, I can't remember the last time. So it actually made it very cost effective for like an American to travel there and spend money. So things like that have made and have helped the European economy in general, and especially a country like Italy that depends on tourism, France, Portugal, Spain. So that's helped out a great deal. But again, those energy prices are a big component of our economy. They're even a larger component of the European economy because they just don't produce very much of their own energy and have to buy it all. So I'm not a doom and gloomer. I just think they're going to have a little bit tougher time than we are.
And just to, kind of come full circle on that, all kidding aside, Europe, you're 100% right. Those countries depend on American dollars, on American tourism, on American vacations. And if, the old expression, if we sneeze, Europe catches a cold, right? So if we do have a recession going into the summer, that will be the ripple effect. People will be staying home. People are going to be a little reticent about spending $10,000 or $15,000 for a European vacation where they may have felt more flush, a year ago or 2 years ago.
Yeah, and Mike, couldn't agree more with you, the point you just made. And I'm just going to add that, today we've witnessed firsthand how intertwined these economies are. So if you take Europe as a whole, China and the US, you're talking about the Europe as a whole, the three largest economies in the world, and the amount of money that China spends relative to how much we spend, relative to how much Europe's, it's all interconnected, right? Mm-hmm. So even an economic slowdown in the rest of the world will have an impact on our economy.
Mm-hmm. So listen, my friend, on that note, we're about out of time, not only for the show, but for the year. This was our last show of 2022. We will be back January 3rd, right in the beginning of the new year. So I want to wish everybody a happy and healthy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, and New Year.
Happy holidays to everybody. And above all, stay safe, stay healthy. We've gotten through this year. We'll get through the next couple of weeks, and then we'll look forward to a better year next. But stay healthy, stay safe, and the rest of it will take care of itself.
And happy birthday, brother.
Happy birthday to you too. It's coming up.
Have a good night, everybody.